I'm 34, male, and I grew up in a small suburban house in the Midwest. It wasn't much, but it was everything to me. My parents bought it when I was 6, and for years, it was a haven of warm memories. Christmas mornings, backyard barbecues, learning to ride my bike on the cracked driveway. That house was more than just walls and a roof. It was the only constant in a childhood that often felt turbulent. You see, my younger brother, let's call him T, was always a problem. While I was the kid who followed rules, got decent grades, and held down a part-time job in high school, T was the opposite. He had a knack for trouble, skipping classes, getting into fights, and running up debts he couldn't pay. My parents, for reasons I never fully understood, always bailed him out. They said, "He's your brother. Family sticks together." That mantra got old fast. When I turned 18, I worked my way through college, barely scraping by. Meanwhile, T dropped out of high school and started borrowing money from friends, neighbors, even me. I stopped lending to him when it became clear I'd never see a dime back. By the time I graduated, I was already tired of the family dynamic. But the straw that broke the camel's back came last year. I had been living out of state for a decade, working as a software engineer. I was finally able to afford a house of my own. It was nothing fancy, but I was proud of it. I kept in touch with my parents, but our conversations were sporadic, mostly small talk and updates. Then, out of the blue, I got a call from my mother. Her voice trembled as she explained the situation. Apparently, T had been involved in some shady business deal that went south. He owed tens of thousands of dollars to people who weren't exactly patient. My parents, terrified of what might happen to him, had sold the house I grew up in, to cover his debts. I was floored. "You sold the house?" I asked, disbelief thick in my voice. "It was the only way," my mother said. "We couldn't let anything happen to him." "And what about you? Where are you going to live now?" "We're renting a small apartment," she replied, like it was no big deal. I hung up, furious. They hadn't even told me they were considering this. The place I called home for over 20 years was gone because of T's irresponsibility. And the worst part? He wasn't even grateful. 2 months later, I found out through a mutual friend that T had blown through the money again. He was back to his old habits. Only this time, he wasn't just borrowing money. He was gambling it away. That's when I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't going to let T's selfishness destroy everything my parents had worked for. I did some digging and found out the house had been sold to a private buyer who planned to flip it. Using some of my savings and negotiating hard, I managed to buy it back. It cost me more than I wanted to spend, but I didn't care. That house was mine again. When I told my parents what I'd done, I expected some gratitude. Instead, I got something entirely different. "You bought the house? Why didn't you talk to us first?" my father demanded. "I didn't think I needed your permission," I shot back. "I grew up there. You sold it without even telling me." My mother chimed in. "But what about T? He needs help. You could have used that money to." "To what?" I interrupted. "Bail him out again?" "No. He's a grown man. He can deal with his mess." It was a tense conversation, but it got worse when T found out. He called me furious. "You think you're better than me?" he sneered. "Buying the house like some big shot. You don't even live here anymore." "I bought it because it mattered to me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You've done nothing but ruin things for this family." He didn't take that well. He started showing up unannounced at the house, demanding I sell it to him for the family. I laughed in his face the first time, but his visits became more frequent and aggressive. One night, he even brought some of his shady friends along, banging on the door and shouting until the neighbors threatened to call the cops. That's when I decided to take legal action. The restraining order was a hassle to get, but it was worth it. The court took my side after I provided evidence of T's harassment. My parents, however, were livid. They accused me of tearing the family apart. My mother cried, saying I was being cruel. My father told me I was turning my back on blood, but I stood firm. "You've enabled him long enough," I told them. "He's never going to change if you keep cleaning up his messes." "I won't do it." They didn't speak to me for weeks after that. I thought maybe the drama would die down, but then came the final blow. A few weeks later, I received a letter from a lawyer representing my parents and T. Apparently, they were claiming that the house was family property and that I had no right to keep it from them. They wanted me to sell it back at the original price I had paid for it, which was absurd given that the market value had already increased since the sale. I couldn't believe it. My own parents were siding with T in this ridiculous scheme. They were trying to strong-arm me into giving up something I had worked hard to get back. The letter even hinted at the possibility of a lawsuit if I didn't comply. I called my parents immediately. "Are you seriously doing this?" I asked, my voice tight with anger. "You're going to sue me over the house you sold?" My father's tone was cold. "It's not right for you to keep it from the family. We sacrificed everything for your brother. You wouldn't understand because you've always had it easy." Easy? I almost laughed. I worked my way through college. I've been supporting myself since I was 18. Meanwhile, you've been throwing money at T every time he screws up, and now you expect me to clean up the mess. "You're being selfish," my mother said quietly. "It's just a house." That was the moment I realized they didn't see it the way I did. To them, the house was just a financial asset. To me, it was a piece of my childhood, a connection to the life I had worked so hard to preserve. They had already given up on it, just like they had given up on holding T accountable for his actions. I decided to fight back. I consulted with a lawyer to make sure everything I'd done was above board. Thankfully, the sale of the house to me had been entirely legal and properly documented. There was no way they could take it from me without a fight, and I wasn't about to back down. But then T escalated things again. He started spreading rumors about me to extended family, painting me as some heartless monster who had stolen the house from our parents. A few of my aunts and uncles called me, asking why I couldn't just let it go. "It's not worth tearing the family apart," one of them said. I was sick of being the villain in this narrative. "Ask yourself why the family is tearing apart in the first place," I replied. "It's not because of me. It's because you all keep enabling T." The final showdown came when T and my parents decided to show up at the house uninvited. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was doing some work in the backyard when I heard the commotion. They were standing on the front lawn, shouting at me to come out. My parents looked embarrassed but determined, while T was clearly enjoying the drama. "Let us in," T demanded. "We're family. We have a right to be here." "No, you don't," I said firmly, standing my ground. "This is my property now. You're trespassing. We gave you everything," my mother cried, tears streaming down her face. "And this is how you repay us?" "I gave myself everything," I shot back. "You gave T everything, and look where it's gotten him." T lunged forward like he was going to shove past me, but I stepped back and pulled out my phone. "I'm calling the cops if you don't leave right now." "You wouldn't dare," my father said, his voice low with warning. "Watch me," I replied, dialing the number in front of them. The sight of me actually making the call finally broke their resolve. My parents begged me to reconsider, but I stood firm. "You're not welcome here," I said, looking each of them in the eye. "Not until you stop enabling him and start respecting me." They left, but not without a few parting words. My father called me ungrateful. My mother sobbed the entire time. T, of course, hurled insults and promised I'd regret this. I didn't care. I was done letting them manipulate me. In the weeks that followed, I didn't hear from them. The silence was both a relief and a sadness I hadn't expected. I had drawn a line, but it had come at a cost. Then one day I got a call from my lawyer. Apparently, T had tried to sue me, claiming he was entitled to a share of the house as part of the family estate. The case was thrown out immediately since the sale had been legal, and T had no grounds to stand on. The consequences for T didn't end there. Word got around about the failed lawsuit, and his shady reputation only got worse. People stopped lending him money, and even some of the extended family who had been on his side began to distance themselves. He had burned too many bridges, and now he was left to face the consequences of his actions. As for my parents, they moved into an even smaller apartment after struggling to pay rent. It was hard to feel sorry for them, knowing they had brought this on themselves by prioritizing T over everything else. I considered reaching out, but every time I thought about the way they had tried to undermine me, I stopped myself. The house is mine now, and I've made it into something I can be proud of again. I fixed up the backyard, repainted the walls, and even turned my old bedroom into a small home office. It's a space that feels like mine, not just because I own it, but because I fought for it. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that family isn't about blood. It's about respect, trust, and mutual support. If someone in your life, family or not, is toxic, you have every right to set boundaries. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is the right thing. And honestly, it feels pretty damn good. If you made it this far, maybe consider subscribing or sharing this story. Who knows? You might need some inspiration for the next time your entitled sibling tries to steal your stuff.